I've got loads of my information, first-hand witness accounts, one of the first responders. Are we up and running?
Yes.
Fabulous. Okay. I know it's only been 2 months, but it feels like ages since I was last doing a talk. But I'm really, really pleased. This was actually the very first talk that I ever wrote. And it's a bit of a passion project. I did quite a lot of, obviously I researched every talk thoroughly. But this one I really poured my heart and soul into as soon as I discovered about this tragedy. And one of the things as a historian when you're doing research and to write a talk, one of the things, I've said this before, it's not just about taking what everyone else has written and then putting it together in my own words. You always want to be adding to any research that's carried out, and I always try to do that. What can I discover, or a new slant on something. And with this, I am very confident I have discovered new information about this, which I'll run through tonight. It's not one of my longest talks, don't everybody be happy about that. It is actually one of my shorter ones, but it's just such a fascinating subject. And as I said, when I put it on the community page to advertise it, it's so local. I know you guys, you get Aggie if I dare veer anyway other than Oldham, and Bardsley in particular, but this, you can't get more Bardsley than this, okay? And it was, 170 years ago, and what I love, and I'm being genuine here, so many people in Bardsley have lived here all their lives, and their parents came from here, their grandparents came from here, and I believe there were people in Bardsley whose great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents were affected by this. So anyway, that's just a little preamble at the beginning. We will get into the nitty-gritty of it, but I do just want to put a small disclaimer. I talk a lot about coal mining. I'm not an expert. Okay, Roy will no doubt be correct to me when I dare mispronounce something, or God forbid put a slide up, nor Kelly, that's not what you're saying it is. But I'm not a coal mining expert, so if anybody has any particular questions, or if 19th century coal mines are your specialist area, I don't think this is your talk, okay? But I know you guys, I know you like death and disaster, so if that's still the case, this is absolutely for you. Okay, so, oh no, I've taken that out. Sorry, right. Slight introduction. So the winter of 1857-1858 was a really particularly hard one. It was noted for just how cold and bitter that winter was. And there was thick snow covering the ground of Bardsley. And I read a fabulous account. It was written 45 years after the explosion by a gentleman who was a schoolboy at the time the explosion happened. And he wrote that just before sunset, on Tuesday the 2nd of February, 1858, a group of he and his schoolboy pals, they were skating on the frozen ponds in the field just behind what's now Bardsley Vale Avenue, then Albert Street. The pond's still there, it was frozen, they were skating on it, having a wonderful time. They heard this enormous, he called it a booming noise, and the ice beneath their feet started to crack. So they scuttled off to the safety of the field and looked. I'm doing my famous pointing the wrong way. Am I pointing anywhere near Smokies? They looked across Ashton Road, so obviously what is now Smokies was then Bardsley Colliery, and they saw thick plumes of smoke rising up into the air, and they started to hear the panic. They heard the voices, they heard shouting, they heard screaming, they heard the feet hurrying towards the site of the coal mine, where many men were finishing work for the day in the Diamond and Victoria pits. So unbeknownst to those schoolboys, they had been witness to a disaster, an explosion that claimed the lives of what I believe was actually 63 men and boys, not the 53 that was reported in the official report. And I'll come back to that later. And so to give you an idea of the real impact that this disaster had on the village, at the time, Bardsley had a population of about 600 people. So if 63, 64 people died, in effect, that's 10% of the local population. I do want to stress, not everybody who died lived in Bardsley. You know, a lot of people who worked in coal mines were itinerant, and, you know, they might have come from Ashton or, you know, further afield to work that day. They might just come in for the day, they might have been on a temporary contract. But, you know, it gives you a feel, 10% of the village lost in that one tragedy. 26 women in the village became widows, and 69 children were left without a father. The village smithy lost both his sons. I think they're mentioned on the memorial, Joseph and William Yardley. They were 10 and 17 respectively, and I will come back to those appallingly low ages. So the smithy at the time was in the heart of Bardsley, pretty much where, you know, the Premier shop, that's where the smithy, the forge originally was, kind of opposite the horseshoe. And at the time, 10 was the minimum age for boys to be allowed to work in mines. Or if you're younger, that's too young, but 10, perfect, great, get down there. And in 1860, 2 years later, they did raise the minimum age to a whopping 12. There were 4 pairs of brothers lost in the tragedy. So one pair was killed with their father, the Ibbotsons. William Ibbotson was 39, and his 2 sons, Ralph and George, were 13 and 17 respectively. So Mrs. Ibbotson lost her husband and her 2 sons. The youngest child killed was 10, and what do you think was the age of the oldest man working down the pit that day? Late 30s? 70? Go on, give me one more. 50. 80. Yeah? The oldest, so we had the youngest was 10, the oldest was 80. And, you know, we would absolutely, with our 21st century eyes, we would look at this saying, well, no 10-year-old or 80-year-old should be working down a coal mine. That, to be fair, wasn't the fault of and I will be finding plenty of fault with the owners of the coal mine, but, you know, that was, they were allowed to work down there. And, you know, if they had to go out to work, it was work they could do. And clearly there was no health and safety as we have it today. They didn't have those restrictions on minimum maximum ages, and, you know, if you wanted to or needed to earn money for your pit, that wasn't Jack Daniels, honestly, that wasn't coffee. If you needed to earn money for your family, then if the coal mine owner would have you, down the pit you went. In the mid-19th century, a collier might earn about 25 shillings a week working down a mine. Older children could earn between 5 and 12 shillings. And this was considered to be really good money compared with other workers. So you can see the inducement to be doing this work. You know, if your son needs to go out to work, get down the mine, or if your 80-year-old granddad, you know, needs to be earning a few pennies, it was good money. But the owners of this coal mine, like so many before and after, prioritised profit over safety. And because of that, the heart of Bardsley Village was ripped apart. And I'm going to talk a fair bit tonight about fire damp. So I'm going to give you an overview of it. Fire damp, I've mentioned it in a few talks. Do you remember what it is, or no?
Well,
I know you know. You were there before it was invented.
Well, the facts go on, we would say.
Fetch your lump. So fire damp, very important when it comes to explosions in coal mines. It is so commonly mentioned in reports as the cause or probable cause of an explosion. Excuse me. It's a gas that occurs naturally in coal seams, and it's almost always methane. Crucially, it's highly flammable and explosive. Great, what could possibly go wrong? The Royal Society, it's a National Academy of Science founded in 1660, and the problem of fire damp in coal mines was first brought to their attention in 1675 by a Mr. Jessup of Brummel, Yorkshire, and he wrote about his observations of, you know, the impact of fire damp in mine explosions in an article called The Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society. And subsequent descriptions of the problems of this explosive gas were well documented in the Society's records. In 1733, Sir James Lowther reported to the Royal Society on a major release of gas in a Whitehaven pit, and in 1815, Humphrey Davy presented his Davy lamps, presented his research on his safety lamp to the Royal Society to address this deadly threat. So when the explosion happened here in 1858, it was a very well-known fact that fire damp was responsible for many deadly issues in coal mines. It wasn't like this is new information, we've never heard of this, we didn't realise this could cause problems. But in 1733, there was a report to the Royal Society by Carlisle Spedding, Steward of Whitehaven Collieries, which asserted that fire damp will not take fire except by flame, sparks do not affect it. And this led to the use of flint and steel mills for mine lighting, but it was later found that those frictional sparks could cause ignition. And by the 19th century, these frictional sparks from hand picks striking hard rock was a well-known but very debated danger. Basically, many recognised this danger. Many said, it's not that bad. Let's think about the money instead. And it was long known, and this is really important, the only way to prevent a fire damp explosion was to have enough ventilation in the mines to ensure that there wasn't enough fire damp building up in an area to cause it to explode if it was exposed to flame or to sparks. So miners checked for fire damp by looking for changes in the shape and colour of the candle flame in the lamps they took down with them, a naked flame. The Davy lamp, invented in 1815, the flame was enclosed with a mesh screen and created specifically for use in coal mines to reduce the danger of explosions due to that build-up of methane and fire damp. Didn't always stop explosions from occurring. So it really was, I know I've kind of laboured the point, but it's really important to understand that fire damp was such a danger, and really importantly, it was a well-known danger. It wasn't something that people didn't understand, okay? Between 1817 and 1967, almost 15,000 men and boys died in British coal mines due to fire damp explosions. It works out at about 1,000 a year dying due to fire damp, right up to 1967. Okay?
I think we were coal gas in explosion after that.
Told you. I'm wrong. He's probably right. Roy is more than likely right. I'll double check that.
Gresford coal off the East Lancs Road.
Okay. Potentially after 1967, isn't it? But at the point stands, we're looking at about 1,000 men and boys a year dying because of fire damp. So, I promise I'm getting to Bardsley. But I wanted to give you, just to show the extent of the issues caused by fire damp, okay? In 1812, there was the Felling mine disaster in Tyne and Wear. 91 lives were lost in the explosion. The cause was never fully determined, but the conclusion that it was probably due to fire damp. 91 lives lost. There were 2 explosions in the Riley mine in Bent Grange, which is like the Manchester Street area of Oldham. In 1850, a roof fall caused a Davy lamp to break, which triggered a fire damp explosion. Either 16 or 17 men or boys died, aged 12 to 24. And a later the inspection afterwards, the report said, you need more ventilation. And so they did install more ventilation, but a later inspection still said you don't have enough ventilation. And sure enough, 3 years later, a fire damp explosion in the same mine, and this time 20 men and boys died, 13 suffocated, 7 burned to death. And what the investigation found, that one man had taken, for unknown reasons, the top off his lamp, and basically there was a slap on the wrist and the inspector said, don't let this happen again. 1857, the Lund Hill colliery explosion in Yorkshire, 189 men and boys killed, aged 10 to 59, caused by fire damp. 1866, the Oaks Colliery near Bardsley, fire damp explosion killed 361 miners and rescuers. And it was the worst coal mining disaster in the UK until St Geneth happened in 1913 in Wales. Just truly awful. 1913, the St Geneth explosion, the exact cause of the explosion unknown. However, it was suspected a spark from underground signalling equipment ignited fire damp. 439 miners died, along with one rescuer. 60 of those killed were below the age of 20, 8 were 14. So in St Geneth, 205 women were widowed and 542 children lost their fathers because of a fire damp explosion which people knew about. Okay? So again, it's just to give you that idea. In Bardsley, so the 1858, I will change that. I have got some slides. Excuse me, the 1858 explosion wasn't the first one across the road. In December 1851, there was an explosion in the Diamond Pit, and that's the pit where the hotel restaurant now is. 4 men were killed, and the inspector, Mr. Joseph Dickinson, and we'll meet him again, reported the fatalities would have been much higher if it hadn't happened at night. So they got lucky. So Joseph, Mr. Dickinson, he was the Royal Mines Inspector, and he reported on the 1851 explosion. And in September 1856, he received a complaint from miners that the pits were still dangerous. So he inspected the colliery, and as a result, he cautioned what was called the underlooker. This was the official in charge of the mine and the supervisor of the firemen. And Mr. Dickinson said there's not enough ventilation. In mining, there are general rules, and the first general rule relates to having sufficient ventilation. So the owners were in breach of the very first general rule of coal mining for the safety of those working underground. And the underlook at this time was a chap called William Hibbert. At the time of the 1858 explosion, he was actually working in another mine, and his brother James had become the underlooker at Bardsley Colliery. So Mr. Dickinson proposed that a furnace and boilers for a steam engine should be installed underground. These would be fed with fresh air, which would send fresh air underground to push the fire damp out of reach of fire and flame. So some safety improvements were made, but it seems that these specific ones did not happen. In 1857, Mr. Dickinson received a further complaint from the miners that the pits were dangerous, and he wrote to the owners saying they were doing too much work for the quality of air underneath. And he advised safety lamps must be locked, clearly the implication being that they weren't being locked. And he said there were 3 important areas. He identified specific areas where double sets of air doors were required. And he visited the colliery in October 1857, and he did ascertain that ventilation had improved. He wasn't necessarily completely satisfied, but he did report that it had improved. And one thing I think is really important, both the pits at Bardsley, West Smaker, whatever it's called, were very deep. Excuse me. They were 470 yards deep, so that's 1,410 feet or a quarter of a mile. And they were known to be particularly fiery. And the inspector's report noted that because of the expense of working so deeply, obviously the further down you go, the more you're going to spend on extracting the coal. And the inspector reported that the management had a strong inducement to produce large quantities of coal to cover the expense of working so deeply, and they worked in more areas than there was air to ventilate. So because they've had to make these mines really deep, they need to get more coal out to cover the costs, and they're working in areas that they shouldn't be. There's not enough air down there to ventilate it. And he also reported that airways were small, and this was quite common in many of the other coal mines. There was so much rubbish in them that was decreasing the ventilation, and that lamps were still being unlocked, meaning naked flames are being exposed to air and fire damp. So I know I'm kind of banging on about fire damp. You know, there were other issues, you know, the rubbish that's accumulating, and I don't know why you'd unlock. Maybe you unlock it to relight it and then just don't lock it again, I don't know. But these were real issues. So on Saturday the 30th of January, on Monday the 1st of February and Tuesday the 2nd of February 1858, there was an inspection carried out at the colliery. On the Tuesday, the inspectors, accompanied by the son of the managing proprietor, the underlookers and the firemen came up in a cage from the diamond pit, finishing for the day around about 4:45 p.m. Excuse me. Just before 5 p.m, 200 men and boys working in the coal mine were finishing their shift. Half the men had come up to the ground in their cage. About half the men were still underground when the explosion happened. And the cause was an explosion of fire damp ignited by shot firing. So shot firing was the use of explosives to blast coal from the seams. I mean, it just sounds insane. You know, they're so far underground and they're using explosives to extract the coal in an area where they know there's insufficient ventilation and they know there's fire damp. And they also know lethal gas, sparks, kaboom. Okay? So the sparks ignited the fire damp, which exploded when the men who hadn't gone up yet were waiting for their cage to come back down to take them to the top. And the force of the explosion threw them into the shaft. Many fell 30 to 40 deep into the well hole. Those furthest away from the opening suffering the least injury. And after the explosion took place, it was reported there was absolutely no shortage of volunteers to go down and help survivors. Policemen came from Ashton to keep order and to kind of control the crowds, those crowds of people the schoolboys had heard and seen hurrying to the scene. And, excuse me, it obviously really paints that picture of the concern and worry. And there was a letter printed in the Primitive Methodist magazine which talks about the consternation and distress quickly spreading, wives, mothers, relatives rushing in wild bewilderment to the scene of the disaster to find out the fate of their husbands, their sons, their brothers and their friends. In addition to the policemen, 5 surgeons from Ashton were immediately alerted and came to help. And you know, everything I read shows people desperate to help those injured and worse. The explosion took place at about 5 p.m. By 7:30, 40 men out of the approximately 100 underground had been brought up with only 2 dead amongst them. A cage was sent down the shaft and found men at the bottom, mostly deceased. Many had survived, and there was a fire in the shaft as well, which obviously delayed the search for survivors. While the fire continued, if they got more ventilation into there, the circulating air could have caused another explosion, so the efforts were mainly concentrated on putting the fire out, and that didn't happen until 2 a.m. the following morning. By 8 a.m. on the Wednesday, 24 bodies had been brought to the surface, and it was discovered that there was still around about 18 missing. On Thursday the 4th of February, Joseph Dickinson, the mines inspector, he went down into the pit and stayed there for a few hours. Chat amongst yourselves, I seem to have messed up my... What happened there? La 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 la. Okay, it's fine. I've got this. I'm a pro.
Just have to make it up.
Yeah. 32,000 people died. Okay, I think, yeah, we can totally solve this. So, Mr. Dickinson went down into the mine and stayed there for several hours, obviously conducting his investigation. So initially, it was reported that 37 men and boys had died, and obviously many others had suffered very severe injuries. So with respect to those who died, the official report by Joseph Dickinson states that 53 perished in the explosion and lists their names and ages. So I don't know when the report was written, other than sometime later in the year, but I have found conflicting evidence which suggests more died. So the Ashton Standard, in an article printed 4 days after the explosion, reported that 37 men and boys had died. And one would assume that the official inspector's report would have the definitive record of the names who died. However, there are names mentioned in the Ashton Standard that are not mentioned in the inspector's report. And I found 3 of those buried at Holy Trinity Church in the days after the explosion. I mean, genuinely not trying to be trite, but the fact that they were buried means that they were dead. So they're not mentioned in the reports, but they were mentioned 4 days later. So like I said, the inspector's report came out several months later. But again, one I think could reasonably assume that a newspaper article 4 days later would be literally hot off the press and know the names of those who died. Oh, we're having a slide now. So basically what I did, I was very kindly allowed to have access to the burial records at Holy Trinity Church, and I spent a long time going through this. This is just an example of one of the pages. But you can see here, this is a page containing names of those who died in the explosion, telling you where they're from. So like Bardsley, Hollins. Like I said, they weren't all from Bardsley. But you can see when buried, so February 7th, 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 7th. So these were all buried just a few days after the explosion happened. Yeah. Ages 16, 15, 28, 43, 19, 12, 29, 14. And you can see they were all carried out, you know, I mean, they were all buried on the 7th. So that's just one example of, if they'd been buried, they died in the explosion, but their names were not necessarily in the formal report, which is why I believe that some names were omitted and the actual death toll was higher. So the letter that I mentioned from the Primitive Methodist magazine states that 53 men and boys died, and it also refers to 18 others who were very seriously injured who might not live, which obviously would increase the number of those who died. I don't know the date again of that letter because it's in an annual miscellany, but it provides additional data to the question of those who may have died, or the number. So I found a total of 31 burial records at Holy Trinity Church, dating 6th of February to the 5th of March. So some of those names, as I've said, are not mentioned in the formal mine inspector's report. So maybe because some of them didn't die immediately, perhaps the inspector's report refers, you know, but then you've got the Ashton Standard saying there were some who died. That, you know, it's difficult to work out exactly kind of where all the information was coming from. But, like I said, I believe 63 died, not the 53. So there is a memorial at the Methodist Church, and I saw it again, it's just round the corner, commemorating the teachers and scholars of the church, which I was very kindly allowed to view twice. So you've got, so Forrester Bradley, he was one of a pair of brothers who died, but his brother isn't mentioned. So I initially wondered, well, if maybe he died later, but he was buried on the 6th of February, the same day as Forrester, so clearly not. And all except Thomas Robinson were buried in the Holy Trinity graveyard between the 6th and the 18th of February. Joseph Yardley dying 12 days after the explosion, hence being buried on the 18th. Now, I have been told many, many times that there is a memorial stone in Holy Trinity graveyard to those lost in the explosion. But I've not been able to locate this, and trust me, there's not an inch of that graveyard I have not scoured trying to find this memorial stone.
Inside that church? No.
No, but what in the actual graveyard?
No, nothing there. No.
Well, lots of people... God, am I arguing with Roy?
Yeah.
I don't, but lots of people have told me that it's... But maybe... I'm stepping away from that one. Anyway, allegedly, there is a memorial stone somewhere in the actual graveyard, so I've not found it. However, this, I think, is the mass grave. Now, I've not found any reference to a mass grave, but also what I haven't found, remember I said the number of men who were buried in the days after? You go round the graveyard, I have looked, I promise you, at every single gravestone in this graveyard many, many times. There are not 30 plus individual graves, and you've got all those men being buried on and boys being buried on the same day. They don't have individual graves. And this was actually a costly business. You know, I don't know how many of you, if you've not recently strolled around the graveyard, please do. It's an amazing place. And you've got insanely ornate memorials. Hello, Lees. Yeah, the Lees. Their presence is very much felt in that graveyard. You can't move without bumping into one of there. Look at me.
The Lees.
Thank you. You know, so the costs. Oh, I'm doing well tonight, aren't I? Right, I'm stepping that down. You know, the cost of having an individual gravestone, these are miners. You've got 10-year-olds working down the mines because the families need the money. You've got an 80-year-old working down the mines because they need the money. They don't necessarily have the money for a grave. So I believe this, just based on my own research and my own knowledge of the graveyard, I believe this is. So two summers ago, that was my own fair work, because you wouldn't have known it was there. It was completely covered over with grass, but I cleared it, really hoping I was going to find that, an inscription. Kelly, this is what you were looking for. Sadly not, but no one else can tell me what this is for. It's located with all the other graves, so I believe that is where many of those who died are buried. I could be wrong, but that's where my research has led me. So yeah, I've talked about the ages. 18 of those who died were under the age of 18, and the remaining men were aged between 18 and 80. And one thing I think is really sad is 2 men are listed as strangers. Their names and their ages were unknown. So as I said right at the beginning, not everybody who died was from Bardsley. You had itinerant workers, and 2 men had obviously come to the mine that day, or maybe a few days previously. They were working, but no record of their name existed to identify who they were after they died. So these are the names, so these are everyone that I believe died. But yeah, the 2 men, names unknown. And that just struck me as particularly poignant, that somewhere there might have been a mother or a wife or children who never ever heard from them again, because whoever had known who they were clearly died in the explosion with them. So I thought that was particularly sad. So but despite all the death, despite all the injuries, the fine levied upon the coal mine owners, what do you reckon that was? £50. Bless your optimism. I mean, obviously, this was a different time, money, values. They were fined £5, which even then wasn't massive, okay? £5. It's difficult to give a real comparison with modern day money, but very roughly, that's about £1,000.
You know how much the miners were paid? Just to give a comparison.
So an adult male working underground could earn about 25 shillings a week. So what was it, 20 shillings in a pound?
About a month's wages, I think, that month.
Yeah, there we go. I like that, about a month's wages. That's what they were fined.
Is the one man 7 years old, Kelly?
7?
Yeah, 3 up from the bottom.
George Turing.
Oh, sorry, it's a question mark.
Oh, it's a question mark.
I mean, times were hard back then, but no, your 7-year-olds were working your cotton mills and losing their fingers from working underneath the machinery. Coal mines, oh no, 7's too young. 10? Come in, Tommy. In you come. No, that was a question mark because I've just not been able to discover how old Mr. George Turner was. Fab. So, you know, a really important consideration is how the injured miners and the widows of those who died would be compensated. Well, the bad news for them, there was no formal state assistance available. They couldn't even claim compensation because prior to 1880, I'm going to mangle some Latin here, before 1880, there was an ancient legal principle that every business owner loved. Actio personalis mortia cum persona, which meant that personal action died with the person who was entitled to seek it. So if you were killed in your line of work, you couldn't claim compensation because the only person that could claim compensation was you. But you're dead. No one can claim it on your behalf. Okay? The liability ended the second you shuffled off your mortal coil. So when miners died, as we've seen, they did in their thousands, any action on their behalf could not be taken. And for the miners injured, so okay, I'm not dead, I can do something here. Yes, you can. You can sue them. You can take them to court. But you have to prove that the employer was responsible. Okay? And I mean, how easy would that be? We're talking about a 10-year-old and an 80-year-old working down the mine because their families needed the money. How are they going to afford a lawyer to go to court to somehow prove that the coal mine owners were at fault? It's just not going to happen. We've seen previously how mass explosions have been blamed on one miner for taking the lid off his lamp, you know, and the coal miners got fined £5. However, in 1880, the Employers' Liability Act became law, which finally allowed workers and their families to seek compensation. So if you died, your family could then seek compensation on your behalf, but you still had to prove that the employer was categorically at fault. This was followed in 1897 by the Workmen's Compensation Act that removed that requirement. All you had to then prove was that the injury or death had occurred on the job. So obviously that's not much use in 1858, and with no formal compensation schemes available to our miners and their families, they had to rely on family, charities, friendly societies and the poor law. So I found a record that the Methodist Church had a collection which raised £4.07 for the miners' family. So pretty much what the coal mine owners were fined, this church raised almost that in assistance. And I have no doubt that Holy Trinity would have done something similar. And there were many friendly societies. And most coal miners were members of friendly societies, and they were usually set up to help in the case of death or injury. So there would have been funds available. Obviously I can't say how much, and it's another additional hardship for the families of those who've just been killed. And one final note about regulation, as I said, one 11-year-old, one 10-year-old, oh, that's there, and this one. You've got an 11-year-old, sorry, you've got 1, 2, 3, 12, 4 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds, you know. The Coal Mines Regulation Act of 1860 did work on safety rules and raised the age limit from 10 to 12. You know, so still acceptable to send 2-year-olds, 12-year-olds, I've been drinking. But it means that out of all those deaths, only 2 would have been spared. Everyone else would still have died, those 12-year-olds and those 13-year-olds. So sadly, thinking about afterwards, you'd think, or you'd hope, that the coal mine became the safest place to work in Bardsley or Oldham or Ashton as it was. But there did continue to be deaths. Thankfully, no further explosions. So you had, so after the explosion, you got Edward Morris, he's 68, Rob Form, Samuel Jones 50, John Jones 44, William Jack, 1866, look how old he was. And yet, 6 years previously, the law had changed. He should never have been anywhere near that mine.
He could have been working in the yard though, which meant he didn't go down the pit, which would be a...
Still.
Yeah, no, it'd just be a it'd just be a change, wouldn't it?
Who invited you? 18 years old, but look, William Slater in 1876, 8 years old. He wasn't working in the mine, I get that, but still, you know, there were still deaths and accidents at the mine following the explosion. So as far as I've been able to discover, it closed for good in 1885 and remained a derelict site. And I've had lovely stories of people playing, you know, in the derelict site as they were kids. I think it was quite a playground. And this photo dates to 1930. So the bit of circles up on the top left showing the site. And this from 1847 shows the old mine shaft. And there's an undated photo, I believe it's after 1847, so this shows the 2 mine shafts.
Yeah.
Thank you for agreeing with me, Roy. And also, what I believe, so the site, after it was developed, there was originally a petrol station there, which developed into the Smoke Pole Grill. Yeah? A cafe, the Smoke Pole named for a piece of equipment, and apparently it was quite known for its weekly dances at the Smoke Pole. And Phil's there going, yeah, oh yeah, I remember those days. And this, of course, became Smokies in 1989 and then became a Holiday Inn a few years back. And so you can see, one thing that really interested me, you can see just how close to Ashton Road those mines are. When it was built, Ashton Road didn't exist. So, you know, because I was like, why would they build it same place in the road? But they didn't. Like I said, it didn't actually, Ashton Road itself didn't exist at that point. Okay, so for anyone who's interested, as I said, so the diamond pit where the actual explosion took place, that's gone, that's underneath the restaurant. And last year, I went in and made friends with Matt, the head of maintenance there, explained my interest, and you know, if you're ever doing any work in the restaurant or, you know, just let me know, I'd love to come and have a look. And bless him, I'm sure it was about a year ago, got in touch with me that they were going to be lifting up the carpet in the restaurant and doing some work underneath. Would I like to come along? Yes, please, says I. And I think I'd arranged to go on the Monday afternoon, and then he phoned me on the Monday morning saying, sorry, we actually looked at it today, but he said there's absolutely nothing. There's nothing underneath. I didn't think there was going to be like an open shaft or anything, you know. But, you know, in the overflow car park, that's where this is. Okay, it's basically when you go into the overflow, and it's all, you know, where you park, but you've got a bank at the end, and I may have wandered up and down there several times. You know, it's just absolutely fascinating. But yeah, that's it. That's my talk. I hope you found it interesting. This real piece of local history. And next time you're driving past Smoky, 170 years ago, it was a very, very different site, a very, very different scene. So thank you.
You've done it again, Kelly. Well done.
Now, I do have an announcement. I'm having to pause my talks. Life has just exploded, and I just don't have time. I never do these half-assed. I never do. I pour so much into them, and I've just not got time at the moment. I don't. Many of you probably don't know. I'm a tutor, and my pupils seem to be reproducing. I don't know how I've ended up with so many, and so I'm just so busy with that. However, unluckily for them, luckily for me, you aren't recording, are you?
Yes.
But the exams, the GCSEs and